racialized persons.
All right, thank you. Good evening. This is call to order of meeting, committee meeting of the Ad Hoc Calendar Committee. Date is June 20th, Monday, and the time is 5:36 p.m. In attendance, we have committee member Erica Castillo and myself. And also we have board member John Weldon, chair of the board, and board member Joseph Sokolovic, and board member Christine Baptiste Perez, meeting remotely, and staff member Superintendent Michael Testani. Okay, and present with us, we have attorney Rebecca Goldberg from Bertram Moses and staff attorney Conrad Valsing from Cape. Okay. Thank you all for being here. So first, if we have a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
All right, I have no discussion on it. Yeah.
No.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, minutes have passed. Then the next item, it mentions right in there that it qualifies for executive session. That is, we received a legal opinion from Bertram Moses about related to holidays and school calendar. And by virtue of attorney-client privilege, we had to at least give it the opportunity to be discussed in executive session. Looking over it, I see no reason why that's necessary. Do you feel any reason for that?
No.
Okay, so I would ask for a motion to waive the attorney-client privilege and discuss the opinion in open forum.
Yes.
So moved, okay. And
Yes, so moved.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay. So I'm just gonna ask Attorney Goldberg to discuss the opinion with us. You can kind of go through it. Oh, can you pass this down to?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just.
All right, good evening. First of all, I want to apologize. I could not be there in person because I have been coughing and I did not want to create any difficulties for anyone, and fair warning in case I start coughing while I'm discussing this. So I'll go through this in some level of detail. Feel free to ask me to go into more or less detail as I'm going along. Basically, as you all know, this matter came to the board's attention through various student-initiated efforts related to wanting to bring Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, which I'm just going to collectively call Eid, but they're two different dates, as school holidays in the future. And I'm going to pull out some of the reasons that they cited in support of their request, because these will be considerations that we should look at in terms of how we think about requests for religious holidays to be added to the calendar.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt for 1 minute? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I just want to let Ms. Baptiste Perez know that I forwarded the opinion to her, so she has it in her email. Sorry about that.
No problem. So one of the really significant points that the students made and that we'll need to grapple with is that when it comes to a day of religious observance, even if you say, okay, we're not going to penalize you, you can be out, but no harm in your attendance, and perhaps we won't give tests on that day. Nonetheless, students and families have to make the difficult choice whether that student is going to go to school on that day and thus forego some level of their religious observance, or are they going to fall behind in class? Because no matter what, they're missing instruction at that point. So that's really where a lot of the tension is, and why these students are saying it's not sufficient to just say, let's take the day as a no penalty day. The students also mentioned, I don't know where these statistics came from or how reliable they are, but they stated that approximately 1/9 of the students in the district are Muslim in support of that claim. We're looking more generically at this point, but we're going to talk about what to do with demographic information, so I'm putting that out there. There's in addition, a concern that when students don't have their holidays recognized while other religious faiths do have their holidays recognized, it causes students of that minority faith to feel othered. And so it's part of the diversity related initiatives of being truly inclusive to have those holidays obtain the status of a school closure. They note that when we're looking at data that's available to us right now in terms of student attendance, it's really an incomplete picture because it shows what students did when they were faced with what many consider to be a very difficult or impossible choice, not what they would do if the day were really available to them to have off without any consequence in terms of falling behind in schoolwork. They also noted that if a large number of students are absent on one day and school is moving forward, that then when those students come back, the instruction is necessarily going to have to catch them up, which means other students are going to be sitting there through redundant instruction. And so in response to that, this committee that we're here today with was created. In terms of the legal analysis, which is what you're really asking me for help with, let me start with a few broad principles. First of all, there's a list of holidays in the Connecticut general statutes. Generally speaking, schools are not required to close for those legal holidays except for those occurring in January or December. This is essentially making sure that you have to close for that winter break. So then the question becomes, okay, well, we have pretty broad discretion to a certain extent in terms of setting the calendar with that small limitation in mind. What about can we choose to close for a holiday when the reason we're doing it is because it's a religious holiday? So the general guiding principle is the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Connecticut Constitution has some somewhat different language, but it generally gets interpreted the same as the federal Constitution. So I'm really relying on the First Amendment for this. And basically what the First Amendment is telling us is that we can't have laws that either create an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise of religion. So there's no U.S. Supreme Court case that directly addresses school closures for religious holidays. There is so the leading case for looking at any question under the Establishment Clause is a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman. It's a seminal case from 1971, and it creates what's called the Lemon Test. I should note that the Lemon Test is not the end-all be-all of Establishment Clause jurisprudence, but it is the simplest and best available mechanism for right now without getting into some very esoteric questions. So the three-part analysis under the Lemon Test and what we should use to make our decisions is that whatever government action is being taken, in this case, the question of adding any given religious holiday to the calendar for closure purposes, we have to have a secular purpose. Now, that secular purpose does not need to be the only purpose, but there needs to be a secular purpose. Secondly, the principal or primary effect cannot be to advance or inhibit religion, and that means a specific religion or just religion generically. And the third is that the action can't create what's known as excessive government entanglement with religion. So where we're kind of monitoring what religions do, things like that. So when you try to apply it to cases about holidays, a good example is a case that I cited in my memo from the Ninth Circuit called Kamek versus Waihe. And it's really in that memo in that case, looking at whether the state of Hawaii could maintain Good Friday as a state holiday. Now, kind of important to keep in mind, Good Friday is a Christian holiday, and that's a majority religion. And what we're talking about is minority religions, and that distinction will become important in a bit. So when the court looked at the first prong of the Lemon Test, is there a secular purpose for the action? They said, yeah, we're trying to find more days for people to have off. I mean, that sounds like what Hawaii would want to find as their secular purpose. We want more days off, right? And that could be the secular purpose. I mean, why they can't pick any other day didn't matter. They just, hey, there's a secular purpose. And in particular, the court referenced a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1952 that I quoted for you, a big block in the memo. I'm not going to read it now, but it's a really important quote, because what it's demonstrating is that the government cannot be hostile to religion. And it specifically says, we can't make someone go to church or observe a religious holiday, but the government can close its doors or suspend its operations as to those who want to repair to the religious sanctuary for worship or instruction. So that quote, I think, is very applicable to what we are talking about here. Do we close schools so that people can go and observe the holiday that they wish to observe? So what this tells us in terms of that first prong of the Lemon test is that as long as we have a secular purpose, any legitimate secular purpose, which can be the accommodation of religious minorities, then we're okay. So you can think about, and I'll get to some of the specifics later, but some of the ideas like maintaining diversity and inclusion, not forcing students to make really difficult choices, not causing students to feel othered, can all be a secular purpose for meeting the first prong of the Lemon test. Saying we want Islam to be the official religion of the Bridgeport public schools would not be a secular purpose, but that's, of course, not what anyone is trying to accomplish. When they're talking about holidays like Good Friday and Christmas and Thanksgiving, some courts have said, well, these have become secularized. Now, that's obviously a matter of opinion, and people will differ on whether, Christmas at this point has somehow lost its meaning as a religious holiday or not. But if you look at a holiday for a religious minority, I think it's extremely difficult, because the reason that any holiday has become secularized has tended to be because it's in the majority. It's become mainstream. Things shut down. It becomes a day of shopping or going to the beach or whatever ends up getting associated with that. If you're talking about Eid or any other religious minority holiday, I think it's very difficult to say, that's just become, it's a Hallmark holiday now. So that's why I don't feel that we can ever go to that argument, which did apply in that Good Friday case, of saying this isn't even really a religious holiday anymore. It's going to be a religious holiday. The question is, do we have a secular purpose for closing on it? So that's that first prong, the secular purpose. The second prong is the primary effect. Is the primary effect going to somehow be creating, promoting a religion or religion in general? And, so when you say, oh, well, Good Friday creates a 3-day weekend, that's a secular purpose, you're not going to really find that with Eid, because you're not going to find that a religious holiday of a minority religion is very likely to have become so secularized. However, in all these cases, they really deal with situations where the majority is being accommodated while the minority religions are not being accommodated. So I think it would be very difficult to argue that we have holidays on the calendar from 3, 4, 5 religions, let's say, that somehow the Bridgeport Public Schools goal is to promote any one of those religions, or to say we're trying to promote religion in general. The promoting religion in general cases are really more about like having a moment for silent prayer. So you're not promoting religion in general. You're not promoting any particular religion. I think it would be very difficult to say that the goal here is to, we're very pro-Islam, we're very pro whatever other minority religion you're talking about. That's not what it's about. It's about accommodating students who need to take off for their observance. It wouldn't matter what religion it was. So then you look at the third prong, the excessive entanglement prong. And it was very interesting because there was a Connecticut Supreme Court case called Griswold, and it did find excessive entanglement in a Good Friday case. But I think the grounds for that is very shaky. Griswold dealt with the ban of sale of alcohol on Good Friday, and the court would be forced to monitor alcohol sales on Good Friday in order to determine if there was a problem. So the way that they found that there was excessive entanglement is one, well, the state has to monitor it. Okay, that one maybe. But the second was, well, we wouldn't know what day Good Friday is without reference to ecclesiastical calendars. I don't think that that's a very viable, at least that second part is a very viable objection at this point, to say, well, if your holiday's on a Gregorian calendar and it's consistent, then we can accommodate it. But if it's not consistent on a Gregorian calendar, we can't. If you look at the fact that Connecticut office, the state of Connecticut currently closes for Good Friday. It's not considered a legal holiday. It has a slightly different status. But as it stands, Connecticut offices closed on Good Friday. So, and how do we know the date? With reference to ecclesiastical calendar. So I don't think that that's going to be the problem here. The fact that many of these minority religions use the lunar calendar, then, you know, the dates will shift with each year. I don't think that that is really going to be a problem. And you're not trying to monitor alcohol sales. You're not doing anything other than closing. Kamek, that Hawaii case, said there's no such entanglement in Hawaii's simple closure of state offices. So I think, and it was specifically differentiating the Connecticut case. So I don't see that excessive entanglement is the issue either. If that's the case, then closing for any religious holiday would create excessive entanglement. So therefore, looking at the lemon test, you don't have any inherent barrier to closing for religious holidays because you can meet the lemon test as long as you adopt the right approach in terms of a secular purpose and you keep the discourse in the board meetings and the reasons for the vote and any prefatory language and any kind of policies should be consistent with the secular purpose. And so I gave you a roadmap in this memo. If you decide that you want to close for a religious holiday, you must identify a secular purpose. I don't believe that that secular purpose would ever stand on solid ground if you say, well, it's because the holiday became secularized. If you're doing that for a minority holiday, possibly for a Christian holiday, unlikely for a non-Christian holiday. I gave you some possible secular purposes that you could articulate. Again, it really goes to inclusivity, the difficulty of advancing the curriculum when a meaningful number of students would be absent. And as the third point, remediating a situation that is unfair or perceived to be unfair by a large number of community members. So those would all be secular purposes that you could articulate. As I said, please make sure that you're consistent in your discourse with that secular purpose. A very complex piece of this, though, is the question of, well, if we add this holiday, what about other holidays? And I think that when you're in a diverse district, this is a very tricky question because the more minority religions you have, if you have one minority religion, it's easy to say, okay, you know, there's enough people here, it's 20% of our population, we're going to close. But what if you have 5% here, 5% here, 5% here, and you have a lot of smaller groups, a more diverse district? You may end up with a situation where you just have too many closures. You would be closing, you know, every week for a different religion's holiday. So at some point there has to be some kind of attempt to draw a line, and we'll discuss a bit of that in a moment. A point that was made at the board meeting that I think bears significant consideration is that, every decision has its consequences, and one of those consequences is when you close school on a day that other people don't have off from work, then the parents will need to take off work and find childcare at a cost to them, right? So if you close down for a religious holiday, what do the parents of the children who don't observe that holiday need to do? They need to take off work, possibly without pay, or they need to pay for childcare. And that can be a really significant cost, especially in a demographic where people are, perhaps struggling to make ends meet and may not be able to take a day off work without pay, without causing a significant hardship. So that's really important to consider, that while you may have all the wonderful intentions over here, there is a cost over there that needs to be considered and accounted for. So when it comes to the situation of you have a diverse district, how do we decide where we draw the line so that we're not closing every other week? It seems that you need to look at something like absence rates. And there was an attempt to do this at the board meeting, and the data just did not show a clear pattern that would necessarily say, okay, we saw a major jump on this religious holiday. So what you need to do is consider how we can get some reliable information. But it is important to note that even if you say we're going to create some kind of a threshold number, you have to consider the students who belong to minority religions that are smaller than that cutoff, whatever cutoff you come up with, will still have the problem that was being described here. They will still, so if I belong to a religion that is shared by 1% of the student body, you're not going to close school for me. So what's going to happen? I'm still going to feel othered. I'm still going to have to decide whether to go to school to keep up with my class, or whether to go to my religious services. And so there is still, someone's going to be having that problem. It's a question of how many someone's. So just recognize the problem cannot be eliminated entirely. So if you're going to close for anyone, you want to have some kind of threshold. I don't have the magic number for you. I can't say it's 10%, it's 20%, it's 5%. I think part of it is trying to understand the demographics of your district as best as you can. So when you look at trying to obtain the data, it's very difficult to do that. The US Census does not collect information on religion. You may have some other sources of data, and if you do, that's a great way to, to try to get some of this information. You shouldn't poll students directly. And so one possibility that I came up with as a way to try to gather some meaningful information about the extent of disruption would be to take the holiday in question and identify the date it fell on in the previous school year, and poll teachers. Say to them, how many of your students were absent on this date? And how many do you believe are attributable to the fact that it was a religious holiday? And so if you have a student who is known to adhere to that religious faith who was absent on that day, or said that they were absent for that reason, then the teacher can indicate that, and it gives you some information to try to disentangle the multiple causes of absences. It would not specifically identify who belongs to what faith. You're not looking to cross-reference names of students. You're looking for, there were 3 kids out, and I think they were out for this reason, or I think 2 of them were out for this reason. And then you also can ask them, how and to what extent did this create a disruption for you? If they say it was no problem, I caught the kid up after school, it was, then you can take that into account. If they say it was a significant problem, I couldn't teach because there were a lot of kids out, it tells you something. And then when you're making your decision, you're basing it on facts. And you also potentially need to be looking at employee absence rates as well, although it is a bit easier, I think, to just say, well, you can take that day off. That's just one of your personal days. So kind of, zooming back out for a second, it's murky in terms of the legal analysis that applies to the establishment clause. But I do believe that if you want to close for a religious holiday, I believe you can do so, provided you go about it in the correct way. And then I think in a diverse district, you really have two options to consider. Either you set some kind of a threshold and you engage in some kind of data collection effort to try to figure out the extent of disruption and act on that. Or you take the approach that is admittedly not ideal for a lot of students, and you say, you know what, we can't close the school for religious holidays. We're not going to do it for any religious holiday, but anybody who wishes to take a day off on one of their religious holidays can do so without penalty. Yes, it will mean that they've made that difficult choice to attend or not to attend. Yes, it means they have to catch up. We acknowledge it's unfortunate, but we can't find a way to do it without creating too many burdens for everyone. And none of that would affect the Christmas break because of the requirement that you be closed at that point. I'm available for questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Can you just detail, to the best of your understanding, a little more about the Lemon versus,
Kurtzman.
yeah, that case, Kurtzman, yeah.
So that case really, what's notable about it is that it set the tone for, for how to determine when the government is getting too involved in religion. So it had to do with a case about the school funding for things like textbooks, teachers, for non-public school students. And so the concern became like, well, if you're going to be paying for the textbooks, are we too involved because now we're getting involved in the content of instruction in a non-public school. So it doesn't have direct applicability to this kind of case, which is why I kind of shifted gears and really focused in on that Ninth Circuit case, the Kamek case. But the significance of it is setting the Lemon test. Now, there is definitely a sense that the Lemon test itself is on shaky ground. It is still technically the law of the land, and all the, even if this test does go away in name, the core principles will exist just in some altered form. And so I don't believe that any changes that may come to the Lemon test in the next year or two, because it has been noted by current Supreme Court to be on shaky ground, I don't believe any of those changes would significantly alter the decision-making framework we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Joe?
Yes, okay. In our decision to approve Eid al-Fitr as a holiday, did we meet the legal requirements of a secular purpose?
I think that's a very interesting question. Certainly what was articulated at the meeting was that it was based on the perceived, the perception that a large number of students would be absent. I recall that language in particular, the perception. So that is a secular purpose, The
May I
question is
articulate,
whether it's founded well enough
Right.
in
may I,
action.
may I articulate a bit for some of what you may have not have seen in the meeting? The board received over 1,000 and change petition signatures from members of the community for the day off. The room was packed with about, I don't want to over exaggerate, at least 80, 80 community members. Is that a fair number?
Yeah, more or less.
And the committee, the local mosque showed up and they showed up in numbers. So that's articulate.
So when I'm talking about the number of people, I'm referring to the number of people who would be affected specifically by the policy. There is certainly, unquestionably, I did see at that meeting and I did see the background materials on this. There's certainly significant community support for adding Eid al-Fitr as the holiday. If the reason there's significant community support is their religious purposes, I think it may become questionable. That's why most of the time when this is done, it gets linked to attendance, because you can have very vocal people supporting, a policy for all sorts of reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you enact a policy, because of that, it will be on solid constitutional ground. So I do believe the reason that was articulated in the motion, which was based on the perception that a large number of students would be accurate, is a secular purpose. The question that I have at this time is whether it's actually factually accurate, because we just don't, and as there was significant discussion at the meeting, there's a lot of reasons we are limited in how we can get that information.
Right. And as well as the motion was it wasn't articulated within the motion itself, was the otherness argument you've perceived.
Yes.
Which would that be a better way to phrase it on the approval of the next holiday?
I have a concern about that, and I'll tell you why. So if you, I'm going to make up numbers, but if you say, okay, 10% of our student body would be absent on Eid al-Fitr because they are Muslim and observant, and then you say, 1% of our student body would be absent on another religion's holiday, let's say Diwali. So you justify closing the schools on Eid because you don't want to other the students who are Muslim. Well, haven't you just othered the students who observe the lesser observed holidays, and the ones who are part of the more the rarer religious minorities, or perhaps the ones who are most likely to feel other? They may be the only ones in their class who are a member of that religion, or perhaps the only one in their school who's a member of that religion. So now we take a student who already feels like an outsider or different, or no one really knows about their religion, and we say, well, we don't want to other this group, but we're silent about othering that group. So I would only do that if you are confident that your demographics are such that you really have one or two meaningfully sized minorities, and you don't have these smaller minorities, 1% here, 1% here, 1% here, so you don't risk othering them.
Right. Yeah, I agree in concept. That actually leads me into my next vein of thought, is setting policy with any kind of parameters will have a disparate impact on protected groups. I mean, because we're not going to have Caucasians. We already got all our holidays. Christians got all their holidays. So the only one left to come for holidays and meet any parameters or policies that we pass are minorities. So we're considering putting in place policies to make it harder for minority groups to get, in effect, minority groups to get a holiday off.
Essentially,
Whereas
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, whereas other holidays that were approved with most recently, day after Thanksgiving, Good Fridays and all these other holidays, they did not have to go through any policies or procedures. They just had to be approved by the board on the school calendar. So my concern is creating a policy, creating something else that was not even thought of or heard of when we did all these other policies until the Islamic community got their policy, got their day off approved and a day off on the holiday. And the perception to me is we can't let this happen again. Is the effect of this committee. And it's really concerning to me that we're even meeting here today on a day the state celebrates Juneteenth and the schools are closed today. And yet we're meeting to discuss preventing other people from getting a school holiday. This is very chilling to me. I'm sorry. Yeah. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, I think in terms of the goal, that, or at least what I'm articulating, is certainly not a path to how not to give someone their holiday off. I think the difficulty is that what we're looking at is, unless you're going to start touching, you can't touch Christmas anyway. Good Friday is a question mark, and some say it's secularized and the state recognizes it. So let's put those two aside for a moment. But what we're talking about is inherently about minority groups. And then I think there's really kind of a distinction between what I'll call large minorities and small minorities, right? So the large minorities, we're talking about saying, okay, there's enough disruption to the learning process that we have a secular purpose to close. Yet we, again, then you do still other those who belong to the small minorities, right? So then your only option, if you want to treat the large minorities and the small minorities differently, is either, so two options. One, close for every single holiday that someone asks you to close for, which is just not going to be tenable. Or take the approach of, we don't close for any of these holidays, and it's a la carte. You take your holiday, and yes, there's some burden to that, but we can't come up with another approach because of the issues we've described. So it is it's a very, very difficult issue. Someone will always feel that they've lost out, because unless you're closing for every single holiday, then someone will feel that they've lost out and that their religion is not being recognized.
That's all I have for right now.
I'll let the record show that Board Member Albert Benahan has joined the meeting. Do you have any? Ms. Baptiste Perez, do you have any questions? Mr. Benahan?
No question.
Mr. Stastani, you have anything you want to add to this conversation?
No, thanks.
Okay.
I have some thoughts I want to share.
Okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, Ms. Goldberg, that, I read this document in its entirety, and I felt that it was very clear and as well put together as it can possibly be, considering all of the nuances. I was pleased to see that a lot of the same concepts that we explored as a board without having this, contextual knowledge. We did sort of go down a lot of these different avenues, right? Without even knowing about the lemon test or about, some of the cases that you've presented. So I appreciate, you having gone through doing the due diligence of supplementing some of our just sort of natural navigations in having that conversation. And I think the lemon test is, although it does have, nuance to it, it is sort of as close as we possibly can get to having a model to structure the conversation around. I want to summarize that in this case with E, as outlined in your roadmap. I think ultimately we landed on the first reason that you've shared here, which says, we decided to allow a school closure for Eid for the promotion of inclusiveness of members of minority groups in advancing the district's commitment to educational equity. And I feel that for the city of Bridgeport, that's something that ultimately was appropriate because we do come from such a diverse district. In another district, this might have turned out totally different, but at the end of the day, we're elected officials for the city of Bridgeport, and this is the community that we serve. So I felt that we sort of arrived at an appropriate conclusion, considering all the different, avenues that we discussed. I guess the challenge going forward is whether or not we'll continue to exercise the same application of the lemon test for other, communities that might come forward with an expression of interest in having their, religions sort of acknowledged in the same way with a school closure. So, yeah, that's, just really a summary of what you've said in your notes here. But I just feel that the board's analysis of the situation was pretty in alignment with what you've outlined here. And so kudos to the board and having been able to, arrive at a successful resolution on the matter. Obviously, there's still some things that remain in the wing, but I think this conversation has made it clear that there's really no way of perfecting this, right? So it's like no matter which way you go, there's going to be some loose ends that are going to remain untied, right?
I think that's right. And I think that, as long as you, are continuously looking for, how are we tying this to our secular purpose? How does this fit in with our overall district objectives, right? Our objectives are to instruct students. Our objectives are equity. I would say those are probably the two major objectives at play here. And so you kind of have to keep going back to those as your guiding principles. So in terms of making that one-off decision, subject to the piece about, well, we don't know how reliable the data actually are in real life, it certainly fits the lemon test. The big question that remains is where do you go from here? Because it works fine for one request, and you have to see, how diverse is your district, how many, and what does that diversity mean in terms of requesting holidays off versus just being diverse.
So that actually brings me to my question. You talked about the two extremes. One is granting holidays to every single request, which is untenable. And the other is having no religious holidays aside from the winter break where it encompasses that, plus Good Friday. So if it's not going to be either one of those two, what would be, your counsel on moving forward and being, in the right vein with the law and so forth?
So I do think that saying that we are going to close for every holiday is certainly untenable. I think the option of we're not going to close for any holiday, but you can take it a la carte is not untenable. It is something you could do, but it would be to the disappointment of some people. So that one I think remains on the table. In terms of the middle ground approach, the middle ground is the one where you have to start looking at data, because there's no way to judge between religions other than based on data. Otherwise, what it's I like this one's holy book more than that one's holy book. That's obviously what you're not allowed to do, right? So the only rationale I can think of, and that the groups that have been through this have worked through, is based on demographic information. Perhaps there is a way that you can get a little bit more demographic information other than, my suggestion. And I wish that there were census data. It wouldn't necessarily tell you levels of observance, but it would give you a good starting point. In terms of, so then I think the roadmap is what I kind of laid out there about polling teachers. That's the only way I can think of to, without polling people and saying, hey, what religion are you? Which obviously is problematic, to find out about what's going on the ground. And in particular, that's going to help you really crystallize the aspect of disruption. Were kids out? Were kids there, but really upset that they were there? The teachers are the ones who have the best access to that information. We know from the board meeting and the numerous people who came out and spoke that is a real problem for a number of students. What we don't know is whether that is enough that you as a board would want to close down the entire school system for it. I will mention one other thing. I don't think it applies to Bridgeport in particular, but I did see that for some of the really large districts, like let's say the New York City public schools, they might look at more of a micro level and close individual schools based on demographic information. I just don't think Bridgeport is big enough to justify that, but I'm mentioning it for the sake of putting it out there.
Thank you. Ms. Baptiste Perez, your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question with regard, I think I'm going to answer my own question, but you can confirm it. The lemon test would also be applicable to the removal of holidays from the calendar, correct?
It really applies to any government action. So I would say if you were removing a holiday from the calendar for the purpose of penalizing a religion, let's say.
Well, no, but okay.
Yeah. But that would clearly, I would say that would violate the lemon test, right? This religion, we don't like them anymore. We're getting rid of their holidays. But I think the way I would like to look at it is about setting the calendar. What's on, what's off. And I think that it needs to be based on contemporary information. Some of the holidays that are currently on the calendar may be, and this was referenced at the meeting as well, may be based on demographics from 50 years ago that really have no applicability today. And so, it might make sense to just say we're setting the calendar anew and here's what we're doing. I would prefer to frame it that way than to say we're removing a holiday from the calendar. I mean, that may be the end result, but certainly the public message of we're removing a holiday from the calendar makes it sound like the religion has somehow fallen into disfavor, versus saying we started fresh, we made it based on contemporary information that we gathered in XYZ manner, and based on that information, we're setting the calendar accordingly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, that was definitely something that was coming to my mind. Some of the outdated demographics that were used to justify previous days off the school year may not be applicable now. However, the demographic that would be polled is different from the student population. It would be actually based off of the teacher population. Would that lead into some kind of like labor or union issue that you can foresee in advance?
I mean, it depends how it's framed in the collective bargaining agreement. If it says you get this specific day off, that's going to certainly be an issue. I think that when you're looking at the different populations, you know, again, you may, it's a little bit easier, I think, with the teachers to, or staff to give them the day off without having to do a whole shutdown. Because you have the option of a substitute teacher, you don't have the option of a substitute student. So they can take it as a personal day, as long as and remember that you have, Title VII, which requires that you make a reasonable accommodation, for someone's religious observance. So, you know, they may not get that day with pay if there's no provision that makes that available to them, if there's no personal days, available. But, you would need to, at least, as long as there's no undue hardship, you would need to provide the reasonable accommodation. So in that sense, you can, you know, when you want to take into account what's going on at the adult level as well, not just the student level. The focus to this point has been on the student level, but I think as long as you preserve the ability for the staff member to take time off with or without pay, that you've met your obligation there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just because I don't want it to seem like I'm pointing at something, but I think one of the things we did take into and it was mentioned, take into consideration is holidays that may no longer be as populously observed by teachers, but that's still observed by the district. And there was a whole bunch of like hypotheticals thrown out there, but you know, now knowing that that is something where we could accommodate. And I was actually looking at the EEOC versus the Abercrombie and Fitch stores regarding Title VII, and with that, because it's more of an employer-employee based case. I wasn't necessarily thinking about like student calendars, but also since this is a committee where potentially, as long as we're doing it in a secular purpose, something where it could be considered that if it's not going to impact our teacher population as much, but I haven't read the collective bargaining agreement, that some things may actually come off the table. So thank you.
You're welcome. I think that analysis is correct, and that as long as you provide a reasonable accommodation to allow for the observance, you're in compliance with the law in that respect. However, if you find that, you know, you have 50 teachers who are all going to be out, then you might start looking at closing school.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. This is very informative, and as Ms. Castillo said, it was very affirming to see that the way the board organically approached this seems to be in line with the lemon test. So really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Mike. All right. I will sign off.
All right.
Good night.
Good night. Okay. So the second and last item on the agenda is talking with Mr. Velsing, staff attorney with CABE, to discuss now in light of what we learned tonight, and your experience with other districts and in this issue, and forming the calendar, especially trying to give deference to requests, and potentially there could be a number of them. So as she explained, we may not be able to approve all, but then, so what has been some experience that you've had with this so far? Setting policy.
Hi guys, happy to be here. Don't know how I'm going to follow Rebecca. That was very in depth. But I think your main issue here, at least why I'm here, is what are you actually going to do going forward? You know, I think Rebecca did a really nice job with sort of the analysis of what happened. But, you know, you guys still have the very real problem. Do we do this the same exact way going forward, or do we set some kind of policy? So I have some talking points. I'm also happy to do like a Q&A. But one of the things I'll just mention on something that Rebecca said, another way to sort of get the data without sort of burdening teachers may be to just compare absentee rates So like, let's say if Eid was on a Friday this year, you know, compare the absence of staff and students on that Friday to other Fridays in that month. And then you can make I mean, it's an inference. It's not hard objective data, but you're sort of making an inference of how many more absentees we had because of that holiday. That's the inference, that it's because of that holiday. So that's maybe one way to get some additional data. I don't suggest it being the only data point in making these decisions, but it can be really helpful. And something else I do want to mention, the board member who has the mask on, sorry, I did not catch his name, but he said, yeah, okay, thank you. So he had some great things to say about equality, and that's incredibly super important. But I do just want you to keep one thing in mind with this First Amendment stuff and the lemon test that was sort of talked about a lot, is that there's really two things at play here. You have two questions when you're doing stuff like this. The first question always is, it's not about equality, it's does our act, in this case, the policy on creating school closures around holidays, does it violate the First Amendment? That's question one. Because if you get pulled into court, that's going to be the end all be all. There's not going to be a secondary issue of equality. The first violation will be, does it violate the First Amendment, the lemon test, the Establishment Clause, all that stuff. That second question that the board member was mentioning about equality, that is equally important, but that's a secondary question. That's more going to filter the legal options. So you can't just make an illegal option because it's more equitable. But if you do have, you know, Rebecca's opinion about an option being legal under the lemon test and the Establishment Clause, then you engage in the equality conversation. That equality conversation doesn't really come into play with the First Amendment. It's not like Title IX. It's not like the 14th Amendment with equal protection. It's not what that clause is about. It's really about, does the state actor here, a school district, is it establishing religion in one way or another, or of course, penalizing religion? So just keep that in mind. That's sort of background information. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what CABE has, what CABE doesn't have. I'm not going to go through more legal analysis unless you ask me about what Rebecca said. I'm more than happy to drone on about legal stuff, but I don't think that's why you want me here. So first question. So I have some talking points. I'm just going to go through them. CABE does not currently have a policy on deciding how and when to schedule a day off for a holiday. There's probably two reasons why we don't currently have one. And trust me, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of sample policies. It's not laziness. You know, if there's a need for a policy, we will create one, no matter what it's about. We have the weirdest policies. So I think there's two reasons we don't currently have one, because this is not a new problem. You know, one thing I'll say is that Branford actually recently just went through this, and they went with the nuclear option, which is no holidays whatsoever for any religious holiday. They did not enshrine that in a specific policy. They had more a general policy about Branford being like a non-denominational, non-religious district. They didn't literally have a sentence that says, Branford will not observe any religious holidays, but it is what they're doing after having spoken to board members there, and they actually acted on this. So the nuclear option does exist in districts in Connecticut, and that is still on the table. And again, that's when you come to that second question. Does it fulfill our aspirations of equality? And it does in a way. You know, it's nobody gets anything. It's the nobody gets anything option. You know, but it passes that first test, which is the Establishment Clause test that Rebecca was going very into detail about. You know, so again, two levels of questions here I urge you to keep in mind. Does it violate the First Amendment? And does it fulfill our aspirations of equality? So that one I think is still on the table, and other districts have done it recently. I'm not going to sort of tell you which one to do, and even Rebecca can't. You know, attorneys, you know, the attorneys here at CABE, we're sort of like a legal reference desk. We don't form attorney-client relationships. But even Rebecca, who has formed an attorney-client relationship with you, she can't tell you which one to do. You know, at the end of the day, it's the client's decision to make their decision. You know, the attorney can strongly recommend, and they can say, hey, if you do this, guys, it's illegal. You know, but at the end of the day, there still is that secondary question that I think you as a board has to determine, which is it fulfilling our aspirations of equality? And that's something neither Rebecca nor I can answer. You know, we can help you with that first prong. And maybe if you have questions about, you know, the equality thing, of course, we're always happy to have a chat. But really, it's that first prong that we're kind of worried about right now. But I think her legal analysis is spot on. There's almost nothing I disagree with in her legal opinion, and that's rare for attorneys. But the one thing I'll say is that, you know, attorneys love citing cases, but the thing is, you know, there's no real case in Connecticut that weighs in on this school holiday thing. So that's why you saw her pulling from the Ninth Circuit. But again, the Ninth Circuit doesn't bind us in Connecticut in any way, shape, or form. We don't have to do a single thing that Ninth Circuit case said. The one in Connecticut that she referenced, the Griswold, we are sort of bound by that. But as she explained to you, you know, it's not about state holidays. It's about sale of alcohol on a religious day. So it's very rare that attorney is going to be like, here is the exact answer because this has happened before the court. So we are in a little bit of gray area about how these state holidays are sort of, you know, analyzed in Connecticut, to be quite honest. So now what CABE does have, we have 3 policies that we are happy to forward you. They don't deal with closures on religious holidays. So we have 2 that deal with religious observances and displays, but that's considering what is going on in the school during a holiday. That is not about the protocol for deciding a school day should be closed, which is really what I think at the heart of what you guys are getting at. Again, I'm happy to forward it along to you. There are some preambles in those policies. Honestly, echoing what Rebecca said, a lot about, you know, religious establishment clause and First Amendment stuff. It's not going to be anything that wasn't in Rebecca's opinion. Let me put it that way. But I'll forward it along if you guys so choose, because it does sort of, let's say, simplify it a little more. And then our second policy that I think is relevant to you guys is we have a school calendar policy. But again, it does not touch this subject. It does not touch this religious holiday closure subject. And again, I think the 2 reasons we don't have the policy is that it is very legally complicated, as Rebecca just showed you. Not only because the First Amendment is always difficult to interpret, because there's a lot of gray area, but because Connecticut does not have a case on point. It doesn't have that school closure case that we could point to and say, yes, this is okay, and these are the reasons when it's okay. We don't have that. So the attorneys are just sort of grasping at analysis from other cases that aren't really on point. And the second reason I think we don't have a sample is because I have no idea how we would create that threshold number that Rebecca was sort of getting at as being sort of the real middle ground here, which is we're going to create a non-arbitrary threshold for when we're going to give the green light to a school closure, which I really think at the end of the day, other than the nuclear option, is probably the most solid way forward. There's a third option, but I'm almost hesitant to even say it because I honestly don't even think it would hold up in court. But there are arguments for it, which is you create a policy on non-objective factors, which is basically like promoting cultural tolerance in the community. I do not suggest that. It is secular by definition, but the thing is, it is so arbitrary and unclear about what that means that A, it's going to be challenged under just due process if somebody applies for a holiday and is denied, but B, it gets you into that scenario that Rebecca was warning about where anybody of any religion can come to you and request a school holiday, and you sort of backed yourself into a corner where you have to grant it, or you're going to get into all those problems under the 14th Amendment and equal protection and all that stuff. So I think it's so arbitrary as it doesn't really offer anything. And then I think you'll just have 180 days closed each year because, you know, people can come for any religion at all or any sincerely held religious belief, which is what a lot of the case law defines religion as, which is basically anything. So those are the starting 2 points. We don't have a policy on point for this. We have 3 related policies, which sort of get at a lot of the language Rebecca was just offering you, maybe in a more easily digestible way. But again, it is not specifically what you're looking for, as long as I understand what you're looking for. So my third point, we being CABE, we are not opposed to creating a custom single policy for a district. I need to talk a little bit more with our general, Patrice McCarthy, I'm sure you all know her, about whether we would even want to in this case because of that first issue I was talking about why we don't even have a sample, because it is just so difficult to really articulate a legally defensible policy about this that is also attuned to a district's need. We would just be making up numbers, whatever the district was trying to achieve. There's a sort of a secondary thing here, which is, you've already engaged Rebecca at length to sort of lay out her hopes and fears about all this stuff. If you really want somebody to craft this policy, I would just have Rebecca do it. She's done 90% of the work. I think the bigger choice here is just picking one of the 3 options, and again, the 3 options being the nuclear option, no state holidays for any no religious holidays for any reason. And other districts have done that, and that's fine. And I think it's actually pretty legally sound. But again, I'm not your board attorney, ask Rebecca, but I'm pretty sure based on her presentation, I think she would be okay with that. The second option, which I think, and it appears that Rebecca thinks is the most sound approach going forward, that's still equitable, which is you have to determine some sort of numerical threshold for when you're going to decide to create a school closure. I mean, that's really at the end of the day, what I think it has to be. And I think the data collection is the hardest part, but I think a good start is, I actually just thought of that idea when Rebecca was speaking about comparing the absentee rates on a religious holiday to the other same day in that month. I think you'll be able to create a pretty good inference there. I would still also do what Rebecca says about sort of polling teachers about absentee rates in class. But again, you just need to have that secular reason. That's really sort of, there's 3 prongs to the lemon test, but honestly, the first one's kind of the most important. You just have to have that secular reason as a state actor for doing something. And that's really sort of, going to be 90% of the work, at least under the lemon test. So having said all that, do you have questions for me? Is there something, that you wanted CABE here for that I missed? Maybe I misinterpreted the request. I'm more than happy to do Q&A to sort of back and forth, whatever you guys want.
Okay. Ms. Castillo?
For clarity, because I think I may have missed it, but you said there were sort of 3 options that we should maybe be considering right now. 1, no religious holidays for any reason. 2, determining a numerical threshold for deciding to create a school closure, or 3,
absenteeism. Yeah.
Yep, based on absenteeism. And then your last option, I missed it.
So that was school closures based on a subjective secular reasoning. 1 being cultural tolerance in the community. That's technically non-religious, but I just think it does more harm than good. I don't think it's a great option. And of course, at the end of the day, run all these by your board attorney, but I'm pretty sure the first 2 were sort of things she already talked about. But again, you always have to tie it back to a secular reason. Even if you get a petition of, 1,000 people of a specific denomination, you still then have to tie that to a secular reason, i.e. absenteeism. It can't just be like, oh, look, we have a lot of people who want to observe Eid and feel included.
Right.
that gets back to that entanglement with religion. You have to tie it to, this is something we use a lot in Connecticut, and I'm sure you've heard it a trillion times in all your other actions. Everything you do as a board has to be related to the educational purpose of the state. And one of those purposes cannot be religion. So it doesn't matter how many people you have pouring their heart out to you about feeling excluded. That's not what this religious test is. This is not about equality. This is really about not entangling government with religion. So no matter what you do, always tie it back to something you can articulate that is not religious in nature.
Yeah, I think ultimately, I will say both of those instances happened when we had this conversation where, there, like Joe Sokolovich will tell you, there was this, outstanding show of support in the community, and there was 80 people in the room.
Mhm.
Well, one person could look at that and say it was this incredible show. Another person could look at that and say, well, 80 people in a district of 30,000 is not an overwhelming show of support.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think where we landed in terms of a secular cause to move forward with the decision for closure was the promotion of inclusiveness of members of minority groups and advancing the district's commitment to educational equity.
Yeah,
So-
as long as that minority group is not minority religious groups, at least in how you articulate it. Because the crazy thing about all this is that, like, you guys are trying to do the right thing. You're trying to incorporate minority religions. But unfortunately, the First Amendment does not let state actors, like, entangle themselves with religion, even though you're technically doing something positive for the Muslim community. You know what I mean? You just have to articulate it in a non-religious way. And going forward, I think you need some sort of threshold about how you're gonna, establish that.
So let me ask you, and I guess I'd like to have the board's feedback on this, but just for the sake of starting somewhere with this conversation, so to express their interest in really wanting to get this done, they started a petition and collected signatures. And then, of course, there was the
Who is they, the board or the community?
the community.
Okay.
And it was, religious affiliations, organizations outside of the school district. It was the community, And anyhow, so they collected signatures, and that was a determining factor of support. And then, of course, they showed up in person at the board meeting, and they spoke in public comment and what have you. And there is a limit to how many people can speak in public comment anyway. So that's a limiting sort of determining factor. So my question is, would it be appropriate, or do you feel that it would be a good starting point to maybe consider, if in the future a minority organization wanted to, express interest, that they collect, let's say 25% of the number. So if there's 30,000 people in the school district, 25% is somewhere around like 7,000 signatures in order to demonstrate that although it's a minority, and again, the signatures don't necessarily have to be from people of that minority faith, but rather 7,000 people in the school district that would support, and sign their signature in getting this added to the calendar.
That's
right?
actually
Because
really interesting, something you just said. So when you said about 1,000 people signed the support for the Eid thing, that included Muslims and non-Muslims?
I think it was largely Muslims. I really don't think, and I don't know, it was definitely overwhelming majority Muslim.
Yeah, because again, you always have to, I just think you have to tie it back to the most common thing is just absenteeism. Just that's the hardest data point, hardest not in terms of difficult, but hardest in terms of concrete data point that school boards can get to determine that there's going to be a rate of absence in the future or a historical rate of absence. That's why Jewish holidays are really common, because there used to be like more representation in certain districts decades ago. You know, it just became such an actual logistical problem with staff and subs and makeup assignments and grading makeup assignments, you know, that it just became a logistical secular problem to have school open on certain holidays. So I think really absenteeism is the go-to data point. And the problem is if you have a petition with 1,000 signatures and let's say, you know, 100 don't have kids, 100 are Christian, 100 are Jewish, 100 are grandparents whose kids are too old, you know, 100 don't work in the schools, you know, what data are you really having represented to the board? It's not absenteeism data anymore. It's community sentiment. You know, so I really think the data point has to come from within the district, not the district, from within sort of the board and the administration and stuff like that. Again, you know, I'm speaking a little more candidly than probably Rebecca can because you're not my clients, you know, so I hope you feel free to ask me sort of a little more casual questions than you would ask Rebecca. But at the end of the day, you know, anything I say, you have to run by Rebecca. You don't have to, but you can't take it from me as if I'm your attorney. You know, if you have a legal question, you know, run it by Rebecca.
Right.
You know?
Okay.
So, you know, just be aware of my conversation in this matter. You know, when I say something is like not defensible, maybe Rebecca thinks it's defensible, and then you guys can go ahead and, you know, go nuts with it. You know, but I just think having a threshold of community signatures has sort of that logical problem that I just presented. But again, maybe Rebecca's totally fine with it, and then it doesn't matter what the heck I say.
Okay. Thank you.
So I have a question about this, but
Also, Christina.
yeah, I see. Thank you. But not in terms of religious holidays.
Mhm.
You know, any request, you know, for any reason, if there's a group that's growing and would like to be recognized, you know, for example, there could be something for Pride Month or something like that. It could be anything. It could be anything. Where is there any standard for preventing discrimination and saying, so let's say it wasn't for religious reasons, so we weren't worried about the First Amendment, we weren't worried about the just in general, as a board makes policies to open up or close a day of school to open it up to a particular group, religious or not. Is there any, you know, would that be the same thing again, thresholds and standards, or is there anything that already exists now for distinguishing between one request and another?
I mean, yes, there are laws, but each act sort of falls under a different law. You know, like if you have sports, you know, that's going to be mainly, you know, a lot of Title IX stuff where you have to have equal opportunity for like men and women. And now there's a transgender aspect to that and how that weaves into how Title IX already exists. You know, I think it really honestly depends on the act you're talking about. Like I can't give some general statement about when minority groups, even of a non-religious nature, you know, how they are to be dealt with in a given scenario. Like it really depends on the scenario, honestly. Like it depends, the worst attorney answer in the history of the world.
So I would imagine that that same idea of having an attendance threshold could be applied either with secular or non-secular requests, if there was such a threshold stated. Because I don't think it should be one for religious requests and one for non-religious requests. Either way, they're a minority group requesting something. Because I just imagine that this isn't ending right here. This isn't ending this year, 5 years, 10 years, it will change. As we talked about some previous holidays that maybe not be as relevant now. Just in general, if a request comes to whatever board is here, it has to be dealt with. And I think it should be treated the same if it's religious or non-religious. It should be some type of standard. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
But
Can I sort of, I mean, sorry, I didn't know if you were done.
Right.
So again, one of the really difficult things to sort of internalize here is that, you know, sometimes law can be cold. And I mean that in sort of what I opened with when I said there's really two questions here. Does our act violate the First Amendment? And then does it promote equality? Because the thing is, when you're talking about equal protection, even if you have just one female student or one transgender student, you know, the law is equal protection. The law is not a school cannot promote gender or sex. Do you know what I mean? We're talking about two completely different barriers here, which is why, like, I would beg you to not sort of compare LGBTQ stuff with this religion stuff, because religion is such a unique, difficult topic, and it has its own specific law, that Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which says governments and state actors cannot establish religion. It is different than the 14th Amendment in Title IX, which is government has to establish equality among certain gender groups. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like a different mindset. It's very, I would say, annoying, because again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to promote this equality among religions. You know, you're trying to do the right thing at the end of the day, but there is just this legal barrier that prevents you from doing certain things, which is the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So yeah. I hope that answers your question a little better, which is we're just trying to ask a different legal question. We're not asking about equality. We're asking about establishing a religious sort of motive, I guess is the best way to explain it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that, you know, this came up specifically because of the request for Eid, for a Muslim holiday, but it is in general, I think, about policies, if any, for granting holidays, as well as just also looking at the calendar as a whole, which has nothing to do with granting holidays, but where things belong and don't belong. But that's a separate thing. But so, you know, tonight's conversation, of course, kicked off by Rebecca, is specifically about religious holidays. But the reason why I brought up what I did is because I think that, you know, you can't just, if we do anything, you can't just stop there. You have to think about how to be inclusive and realistic as requests come, other than being closed 180 days.
I see. So maybe you're trying to segue to saying, like, what if people want off for Pride Day? Is that a possible inference of what you're saying?
Or St. Patrick's Day, or I don't know what, you know.
I mean, I don't know enough about St. Patrick's Day to know if it's religious or not, but it's
no, I don't think so.
A little religious.
It's definitely secular.
But if we stick with the Pride Day, you know, again, you're not bound by the Establishment Clause, because as far as I know, LGBTQ is not really derived from some religious basis. You know, you're just not bound by the same questions, honestly.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Ms. Baptiste Perez.
Oh, thank you. I just have a general question regarding more CAPE services, because to be quite frank, our district fails on collecting sufficient data with data points. And so this is something, we barely have public attendance at our public meetings, our regular meetings.
Really?
And
you guys
are huge. So actually getting bodies to our meetings is a point where there's not a lot of people at our board meetings for whatever reason there may be. And so with our district having 20,000 students, normally when there's a loud outcry of support and information that does come through, especially from people within it. And one of the things I tried to hone in on when evaluating was the change in the demographics to Bridgeport, in support with some of the city's own initiatives with the state of obtaining refugees from Afghanistan. So there's already data available to a change in demographic of people coming in from a particular background, supported by the city and the state. So to show a change in demographics, because we can't collect that via a survey. And so it was really hard. So finding that kind of information really stuck to us. But like in a district in general that has a hard time with collecting sufficient data, and another, this is tangent, but an example nevertheless, is like we couldn't get 10%, not even 10% of parents to answer on a COVID mass survey. So what services does CAVE offer so that we can actually become a better district? Because I'll be blunt as well, like as an elected official in a city with over 150,000 people, not even 2% came out and voted in that election. So with a somewhat elected, but not by an overpopulous amount of the population, how do we get that data? What could be done? Because when people talk, it does attract our ears, because normally it's in silence to know what's exactly going on. So really knowing what to collect, because it's hard to see the establishing the threshold. And this was my logic with EAD, was I followed the paper trail from the city and the state. And so I was able to see with my research that the demographics were changing and in support. And when we have our entire board meeting, which is normally empty, packed to capacity with people outside, that's also saying something as well. So I guess what can be done so we can actually collect data, because that's not provided, and I hear the suggestion, but in reality, I don't see it happening.
So Rebecca had the one suggestion, which was asking teachers point blank how many absences they had in a given class on a holiday. And then the inference being, they're probably absent, or at least a portion of them are absent because of the holiday. And then she had sort of a secondary inquiry, which was like, the students who were there, did they seem upset they were there? I mean, I don't know how you're going to get a teacher to answer that, or how they're going to answer that, or, that seems like a strange question to ask anyway. But I think the other thing I mentioned would be really helpful is just, look at your absentee rates of students and teachers on the holiday and compare it to other similar dates. I mean, I just can't think of any other way to do it, honestly. And no district has asked me to come up with a way. We don't have a policy on it. I haven't seen a policy in another district on this. If you guys are really starting to think about that as a viable option, engage Rebecca to look, or I can look a little bit. Rebecca and I can divide the state, in half or something. We can try to find something for you guys. But I don't even know of a district that has set a threshold that I can say, like, here, this is what Stamford is doing, or this is what Hartford is doing, because they don't have that number, because I think a lot of the religious holidays, are probably a little older. Like, they were baked in, at a time when, this First Amendment stuff, how do I put this? That some of the more minority religious holidays weren't under as much sort of scrutiny, as probably Muslim holidays are. So I completely sympathize with the lack of data. Those are the two suggestions I would offer on getting data. It just really has to be in the schools. I think the community demographics would be helpful, but again, I don't know how you get that data. It's not on Ed's site, if you guys know what that website is. I mean, those are the only two things I can come up with. Again, the community polling, I think it's a good supportive document. I don't know if it can be the sole basis of like school closure, because of what I was saying about how it doesn't really tie back to the schools directly, unless you phrase the survey in a certain way of like, will you miss school on these holidays? But then again, you're like, I think the district is getting too intertwined with religion. I mean, if outside groups want to do that, maybe.
Well, you know what, Conrad, actually, we did receive several hundreds of emails, and I mean, I didn't have the time, but to filter through it all. But the majority that I looked through, one of the things I did look at first is, do they have a Bridgeport address?
Yeah.
And then you can easily tell, like, is it a resident or constituent? And I mean, even with that information, I mean, not being able to filter and process it, names started to sound familiar. There's kids in the district. So without us soliciting responses, we were able to hear parents of children in the district.
Mhm.
I just think somebody on your admin staff in the schools has to take that qualitative data and make it quantitative. They have to sort of tie it to some sort of number, because I don't know what you put in a policy that makes it legally sound unless you're talking about some sort of numerical threshold, which is, I'm pretty sure, what Rebecca is suggesting. And I think it's honestly a good suggestion because the other stuff is just way too nebulous.
I guess the issue with resorting to absences is that we already know that we're dealing with a minority population.
Mhm.
So say the students or the teachers go ahead in the next year and they survey that, or, in 2 years, however many years we determine is necessary to make the decision. And the results are that it's a really small minority,
Mhm.
which is what the expectation is that we're talking about a minority religious group, and one can assume that the data is going to result in a very small number of students in respect to the district, right? So,
Yeah, I mean,
why bother then to go through the effort, the big effort of putting that burden on the teachers and trying to figure out, from an administrative perspective, what the processes are going to be to implement all this and that, to arrive at something that we could have figured from right here.
I mean, it's not, how do I say this in a diplomatic way? It's not about sort of, you need to articulate the non-religious reason, right? And the best way to support that is with data. It's not about, Bridgeport will go bankrupt and all our schools will close if these Muslim students can't show up to school on Eid and it's a real school day. That's not really the question we're asking. It's not, what is the threshold that is going to destroy Bridgeport logistically? It's really just, when do we feel as a board that it makes it impractical to hold school because of absenteeism? So it doesn't mean you need a majority religion. It doesn't mean you need 51%, because, okay, there we've triggered, everybody's going to be out. It doesn't need to be that severe. It just needs to be, what? This is kind of impractical. This is too much absenteeism. And again, a good comparative, especially if you have to articulate this to like a court filing one day, is compare the absenteeism rate on that holiday to a non-holiday. And then say, look, we had to deal with greater absenteeism. This right here is your non-religious purpose. We had increased absenteeism because of this holiday. And it made having school impractical because of staff or students. It was too much of a burden on our district because we had this increase.
I see.
So no matter if it's 90% Muslim or 1% Muslim, you're going to have an increase in absenteeism. You're going to have the non-religious argument right there, no matter what. But the thing is, if you set that threshold so low, let's say 0.3%, in order to get a school closure day for whatever holiday, Diwali, Sukkot, Eid al-Fitr, paganism, whatever, as soon as you hit that 0.3 threshold, you have to cancel school. So you need to set the threshold high enough to sort of not cancel 180 days. But you need to set it low enough where you want to engage that secondary question, which is equality. So it's really extremely complicated, and I cannot empathize enough with you guys. We can talk about this honestly for the next 5 hours. You can call me tomorrow and we can talk about it again. It's a difficult decision. And I wish I had a policy I can just show you guys, like I can 99% of the time, and say, oh yeah, here's what these guys are doing. I just can't do that here. And I'm pretty sure Rebecca can't either. That's why she's looking at Hawaii Ninth Circuit cases, to try to help you guys make a decision. I mean, I don't know. Like, we're not bound by the Ninth Circuit. We don't have to do a single thing in that case. And then the other cases about like alcohol sales, like what does that have to do with, school closures? It's a very weird area to be in.
Yeah.
I think those are your three options, though, that you repeated back to me. Again, the third one is a distant third. The
Yeah.
one about the non-objective, non-numerical basis. That's non-religious. I really just think it comes down to the nuclear option and then that some sort of numerical basis.
So,
And I think- Mhm.
Yeah, Joe, I'll give you just 1 second. I had something. So what about the option of just doing nothing?
Like no policy, you guys created Eid as a holiday and just,
And every time a request comes, we just willy-nilly either say no to somebody or yes to somebody. Now, willy-nilly sounds very.
yeah, no,
sarcastic.
I get it.
But
Trust
in
me.
other words, like,
I'm
say we
not the
get,
police. I'm not.
say we get 5 requests in a row, one after the other. We say yes, 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 and now we can't say yes anymore. And we don't have a reason to stand on, a leg to stand on, why we're not saying yes, other than there's no room in our calendar. Like, what about that option?
I mean, at the end of the day, you can do whatever you want, but I really feel like that 6th person who comes to you is going to sue you if you say no. You
Right.
know? And
I
then
think
you're
that's the reason why we're here. Is for
yeah,
that
and
very
then you're
reason.
going to be paying Rebecca a lot more than whatever you've already paid her.
Okay,
Um,
Joe. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I think the reason that there's no policy, okay, a couple of things. I did look around for policies throughout Connecticut. I did find one, which was one of the reasons we saw that it was for basically a denial of the holiday and just recognition on a calendar. Now, I think this policy shows me that it's just a mistake to rely on attendance only in deciding whether it has such a disruption to the school environment, because this policy states something another board member brought up as an argument that we could have school and not have any major tests or major lessons on that day. That's a disruption to 19,000 students in the city of Bridgeport to accommodate the few rather than have everybody off. It's less disruptive to have everybody off and everybody be on the same page rather than have the 70% or 90% or whatever the number is of students who don't celebrate the school in school learning nothing of significance
Mhm.
to allow the 5% or 10% to be off.
Yeah.
Or
Can I actually stop you?
alternatively not
Can I actually
having.
stop you for 1 second? Because that was really important, what you just said. And I'm actually incredibly impressed that you even found that policy. So that is a separate policy. That is a policy about holding school on a religious holiday and what the schools can do during that holiday. And districts do have policies that say, hey, we don't offer tests on the Friday before Yom Kippur. But guess what that's tied to? It's tied to a historical absenteeism rate based on the Jewish demographics of the district. So if somebody sued them for that policy and says, you know, some non-lawyer looks at that and says, hey, I think this violates the First Amendment, they will likely still, I mean, I don't know, because we're just talking theoretically, but they will likely have a non-religious reason for why they imposed that in the first place.
Right, which is that leads to the non-secular reason being something that other than absenteeism to measure impact on the school day and the school instruction, which would also support us for the opposite of closing with only 5 or 6 or 7, whatever percent threshold, which I'm against.
Mhm.
Mr. Lombard brought up doing nothing, kind of stole my thunder there, but he did it a little offhandedly. But let's see, I'm going to weave a little narrative. We're going to talk about a holiday. We're going to talk about a holiday that we reject as a board.
Not offhandedly.
Okay? Not to offend anybody except Steinfeld fans, we're going to talk about Festivus. All right.
For the
Festivus comes off as the same way this one started was a student-driven agenda item. A student comes to the board and says, I want Festivus off. We need to give Festivus off so we're fair to everybody. Is that student going to have 10, 15 students to come behind and give us reasons and be able to properly articulate why Festivus should be a day off? Will that student or will that group be able to eventually come up with 1,000 petition signatures to get Festivus off? Will they be able to articulate secular reasons such as having to pause tests and instruction or have absentee rates to give that day off? No, they're not going to pass those thresholds. And those are thresholds that we as a board just passed and focused on. And we just passed it. I don't think we would have passed Festivus. I don't think if one person came up and had Festivus, one person came to the microphone and asked for Festivus off, that it would be approved, and we would not be in trouble for disallowing that holiday. We are empowered to approve the holiday. We are empowered to set the calendar as a board. That's one of our few powers, other than hiring the superintendent and evaluating the superintendent and setting the budget. Setting the school calendar is one of our only powers that we have. Now, they didn't have to rewrite the Constitution or add an amendment for the federal government to add a holiday. It's left to their powers. The state of Connecticut did not need additional laws or procedures to stop them from adding a holiday. I don't think we need any new policy. I think doing nothing is probably the best, since it seems what the majority of the districts across the country have done. Do we know of any, focus on just the schools that approve Eid? Have they had, I mean, New York City's done it for a while. They did Eid and Diwali, and I think there's one of the districts in Connecticut that did Eid and Diwali as well. And a couple of more did Eid. Have their doors been beat down by all these? I mean, we're creating solutions for something that's not a problem yet. And we already have a mechanism in place, which we use pretty effectively.
Yeah, I mean, yes, period. I mean, it's fine. Again, you can do whatever you want at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what I say or what Rebecca says, you know, and a lot of boards do go forward without this policy. You know, I just think, you know, your good hearts got you into some gray area. And of course, there's always, I guess, the fourth option of just doing nothing and living your lives. And then if and when this comes up, maybe it's in 10 years, maybe it's next week. You know, I don't know. But then how you go about that process, I mean, I don't know. If you feel you do a similarly good job, if you feel you did a good job this time, you know, you're good to go. You know, you voted and discussed in public and you didn't violate the First Amendment. It's just a board can be sued at any time for any reason. A person doesn't have to be right to file a lawsuit. You know, that's what the courts are for. You know, having a policy in place doesn't prevent you guys from being sued. I think what Rebecca is really more thinking about is just, if you guys are sued, then we have to start talking about the lemon test, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
You know, but of course there's a fourth option, just do nothing, we say goodbye, and, you know, you guys email me and call me with all your other problems. But
or alternatively, just set a policy, because policies, as we know, we could overturn a policy with 2/3 vote anyway.
Mhm.
So if it's problematic, if say we put 20% and 19%, oh, this once, let's just go past it. 2/3 of the board say okay, then the policy is moved. I think as I'm against the policy anyway, if there is any policy proposed, that policy should just incorporate a legal parameter, such as any holiday added to the Bridgeport public school calendar must have a secular purpose or a secular reason, just so we're always aware and cognizant that there needs to be a secular purpose.
yeah, that's great. And I mean, it would be another data point of evidence if and when you guys are sued, you know, the same way that all the evidence of what you guys just did with the last holiday. You know, a policy doesn't prevent you guys from being sued. You know, it helps you guys as long as you followed the policy, but there's also a sort of a double-edged sword, is that if you violate the policy, you know, it's also sort of clear evidence for the other side. You know, like, hey, this is the policy that they didn't follow. You know, so there is sort of a double-edged sword to a policy in that sense, especially if you don't see this coming up a lot. You know, but if you see this, I mean, there's no way to really have foresight with this issue, but if this is going to be a common thing going forward, that's when policy really helps. Because the more common something is, the more likely you're going to upset somebody who will then engage some sort of, you know, action against the board. But at the end of the day, of course, there is always that fourth option of just do nothing and, you know, live your lives. But again, I would run that one by Rebecca as well.
I just want to add that the other side of the coin is that the policy could actually help the minority group. It could actually help them, as opposed to some board members saying, nope, you're not getting that day. But if they fit within that anyway, And like you said, you can always overturn a policy, but then it's like, well, maybe these board members have a certain bent in a certain direction. That doesn't matter because it fits, so it's not only the one side of the coin, not only and it's not necessarily at all that side of the coin that it hurts the groups. It could actually serve to help. Just want to put that on the table as well.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Also, if I could add to what Mr. Lombard is saying, I feel that, with Bridgeport being the largest school district in the state, if there's anyone that should be setting the precedent about how this goes in the state, it should be Bridgeport, right? I mean, we have such a unique circumstance in terms of the diversity that's in our district, in terms of the size and the population of the district, and I do foresee that the possibility that if it's going to come up again, it'll probably come up in Bridgeport or in New Haven or in Hartford. But I mean, Bridgeport being obviously at the top of the list. So why, I mean, the whole purpose of this committee being formed was to be proactive in creating a policy that addresses it. So to walk away from this committee defaulting to let's not do anything, feels a little like, it just feels like a missed opportunity to really make an impact and do something that we can live with. It's like, this is why we're having these conversations. What we're learning today is that there is no perfect way to do this. So we're not going to aim for perfection. As board members, we should then, go off the deep end, concerning ourselves with the details of the specifics of this, that, and the other. If we acknowledge that there's just no way that we're ever going to arrive at perfection, but what can we do to make it applicable and have a threshold for our district, make it work for our community? Let me ask you, is there another data point that you think that we can possibly defer to?
Absenteeism?
Yeah. Like, would you say that, overwhelming community support could be something that we could defer to?
I think that, again, gets you into the gray third option, which is subjective reasoning. Because, again, it's community sentiment, it's community tolerance, it's community equity, but it's not directly tied to the operation of the schools, the educational mission.
Okay, I see.
So that's why I mean, if I think of something brilliant, I'll happily email one of you guys, but I just can't think of anything other than absenteeism. You can put that question out to Rebecca, just like, what other number can you imagine?
Yeah.
That would get us to where we want to be? I just can't think of anything. I mean, can you guys think of anything? I don't know.
Well, I mean, in all fairness, when we did have this conversation, we came up with the same idea, which was absenteeism. And we brought those numbers to the table, and It turned out that there wasn't any major sort of distinctions between this day or that day. And I believe the superintendent had just randomly picked certain days. And I mean, we tried to look at that data a number of different ways and arrived kind of at nowhere,
But again, even a 1% increase is an increase in absence. If there's 0, then I think you guys are kind of out of luck. I mean, because then there is absolutely no absenteeism in any way, shape, or form. It's just a fake answer.
So actually, in one case, there was a decrease in absenteeism, but that's not what I want to mention. So one of the things I think is that, and you kind of alluded to 1 year, 2 years out, is that not rushing into things? I feel like you also mentioned, Conrad, that, well, if you say 50%, then everyone's going to be out that day just to make it happen, so you don't want to have a crazy high number.
Mhm.
But I do think that there's some relevance to what you're saying. I think that the community support is an important element. And as far as the data point, I think that is. And in fact, I think that could be measured by the following year's absentee rate. Because if you have comrades, Christians and Jews and Buddhists who say, you know what, we want to support our Muslim community or whatever the community is. And they say, therefore, we're going to take this day off. We're all going to recognize it. And all of a sudden, you've got a 2% increase. There's your 2% or 3%. So I think that the number should be low. I don't know if it's 5% or 10%, whatever it is. But I don't think it should be based on historical data. because people may not have taken the day off. Even the people of that religious affiliation may not have taken the day off. So it's not really because they didn't know they could. And then the next year when they know it means something here, it makes a difference. When I was thinking this all along, I'd like to look at the following year. Still saying it's an optional, you could, we're having school, whatever, but measure that and say, oh, look at this. It's the data of the absenteeism, but it's also probably community support. Because one of the things that happened was during the meeting, student ambassadors spoke up who were not Muslim.
Right.
And were very strongly in support of it. And one of them even mentioned, I'd take the day off. Like not just to have a free day off and go play video games, but to support this group.
Yeah, sort of like a civil rights movement of.
Right, and I think that's kind of what we were experiencing in making the decision based on
like fear of future absenteeism.
Well, no, I don't know that the fear was an element, but I'm saying that it could be a data point. In other words, it could affect the same data point of absenteeism. So not another thing that we're measuring, but that measure is of something that's more relevant because it's really effective.
I agree with you 100%. I don't know if that could be like the sole supporting data point. It might, again, we're all just making stuff up right now because there's no case on point.
Well, there would be it would just be the absenteeism. It would just be that rate.
Yeah.
That would be it. But it's giving it an opportunity to be a little more organic. Or not.
I think the historical absenteeism is more just tied to the very practical reality of the board acts most of the time based on like previous occurrences. You can act on future fear of absenteeism that a community petition may generate. Like, oh, look, we're going to have 10% absence because all of these non-Muslim.
Right. But what I'm saying is not to act, but to wait. Not have to make a decision in that moment, but to give it an opportunity so you could act on the next year's data.
Are you speaking more, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we want to write in policy?
That's a good question.
Can I say what I think?
Yeah, sure.
Trying to say?
Okay. Well, I'm talking with them.
I understand.
Okay, but I'll let you.
I'm having an interpretation.
Okay, all right. So we're going to let Chairman Weldon speak.
Okay.
But
I think what Mr. Lombard is saying is if we established all religious holidays as being ones which could be observed, but that did not close the school system, that enough students would take the day off, whether they were or were not Jewish, were or were not Muslim, or whatever. And in that respect, affect the absentee rate. Just by showing their support. Is that what you're saying? Because as it is now, we don't have any holidays where you can just take the day off.
Right, they're all just
You're either everybody's in or because they're all observed with the closure of school. But if you just said, okay, we're going to reset the calendar and give everybody the ability to take that day off without penalty. And then, let's say you had, a 2% absentee on Yom Kippur. But you didn't have that information before because the school system was closed. So you had no idea who would or would not show. But if you established it this way as a test, like you said, as a looking forward, now that tells you something, but you're never going to know if that full absenteeism was fully Jewish people or Jewish people with other non-Jews who just wanted to be in support. But it's going to give you a number.
Yeah, and it's going to give you a number of people that are still affecting the learning in the classroom or, the way the district is performing on
I
that
think
day.
that's what you were.
Except I wasn't talking about resetting the calendar.
No, but
I was just saying for if someone comes up for Festivus and then we say, okay, Festivus was this day, next year it's on this day, we're not granting the holiday right now. We're just not.
You're talking about a new request.
We're saying a new request. I'm talking about new requests, for moving forward. And then we're going to say, we're going to look at it. So we have, something to move forward to. We'll see how it affects it going forward. Because if there's a lot of support for Festivus, whether or not they're Seinfeld's fans, they might say, I'm going to support you in your Festivus take the day off too, because I think that's one of the things we were affected by was community support.
Yeah.
And the Catholic bishop, the Jewish organization, the Protestant groups, where there's a lot of community support for granting this holiday. But yet historical data did not justify it one way or the other. It was not there at all. And so it was like really based on that. And I think that's a real data point, but I don't know how else you can measure it other than taking a look at absenteeism going forward. And I was thinking that in the moment when that one student ambassador, I think she's from Fairchild Wheeler, when she was speaking and she was saying, I would support this. I would,
Right.
And so it's like, yeah, that's what we're experiencing in this room right now.
Right.
Is the community has shown up, And so if you want to have a data point to fall back on, so when a group requests something, say, well, we're gonna table this till next year, and I'm just putting this out there, so that you actually have something to look at. Sure enough, there was a 2% tick, and so we wouldn't have to make our decision only on that. But if we had a policy that we would, then good. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just, I might be unclear, but it sounds like you're suggesting that the students be able to take off without penalty is
Yeah, like it was.
yeah, okay, yeah. I just wanted to be clear on that point for a second. So let's say we got 2 or 3 at once. How does that affect us with state law mandating 180 school days? Does that, if school's optional on that day, is it considered?
That's a good point. Maybe we should have that in the policy too. We can't consider more than one in a year. We can only do so much at a time. That could be part of the policy.
That actually, it's my understanding that each student is up to 10 excused absences a year.
10 excuse.
Oh, you're truant, yeah.
Already factored.
So that's a separate, statute and legal inquiry
So,
about truancy and absenteeism. It's different when a student takes off of school and has an excused absence. That's different than a district deciding to do something quote unquote religious in nature, which is a school closure, which can't be done for religious reasons. But allowing an excused absence for a holiday, that's just state law. The SDE has guidance on that. That's already fine. You don't have to put that in a new policy. I would be absolutely shocked if you don't already have that in a policy.
Well, yeah, and then there's also the issue that, I don't think the Muslim community would have left us alone. If we said that, let's table this until next year. Let's see how the absentee rate falls on Eid this year, and we'll make a decision about it next year. I don't know. I feel like it still would have been this perpetual, you know what I mean?
Could have been, but if it was already in the policy, that would just be the way it is. They request it, and that's the way we do it. It's just thoughts. This is just discussion.
Yeah, no, and I totally understand. Like, we're all just sort of brainstorming right now. But at the end of the day, what we're really thinking about is that secondary question, which is it giving us the equality we want? Is it our aspirations of equality as we see Bridgeport pursuing? That's really what you guys are trying to figure out right now, which is like, what do we want to do as a district? And it's really, all of this stuff sounds, legally okay with me. Again, run it all by Rebecca, whatever you finally choose. But again, just remember, separate the two inquiries. Is my suggestion, my being a board member, is my suggestion legally sound? And secondarily, does it, promote the equality that I want to promote as a board member?
I mean, keeping in mind that the secondary thing is the driving thing.
Mhm.
But it has
Yeah,
to
of
be
course.
out.
Which is the annoying thing about the first thing, because it's like you're trying to do the right thing,
Anyone else have anything?
Christine.
Oh, sorry. Thank Ms. Baptiste Perez.
Yeah, I do want to comment regarding Eid, is that this has come from friends that's lived, worked in the school system, talking to people, that the push for this holiday existed approximately about a decade ago. And so to a certain extent, it does kind of support maybe a policy should be done, because it was never seriously analyzed. But also when I did interact with community leaders regarding Eid as a holiday, there have at least been allegations of when it was brought up to members of the board or the superintendent, they were ignored. And so this lack of to a certain extent, this almost supports the idea of having a policy, because when you have something that's been requested for about a decade, no one's bothered to follow up with information, and then we have the gap of COVID on top of all these other international policies that increase the population. Maybe there should be something in stored, but a bit of the implication that I was going with is, how well do we know our population in the community? How well do we actually collect the data? Because those are the points that we actually have to rely on. So if I see emails and correspondences dating from years back about consideration of this holiday and what the logic to whatever the previous board may have had to ignoring it, you know, that at least begs the question, the past leadership then. And, you know, to a certain extent, being able to evaluate and see what's happening in current times to develop the data points are good. But I wouldn't sit back and pretend that this is a new issue when I've seen evidence and support that or that EID was not, and that this is something that's been being pushed for years. So that's my only commentary towards that, is I wouldn't want to pretend that this is something new, but maybe as the board, we could have, and by we, that includes the past board, could have been tracking this and collecting data far out in advance instead of ignoring the population. Like I feel like I have to go on record and say that, because I know that this push has existed for years.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
This was my original when I raised my hand
Okay.
about why we're here. And it's going to be kind of on the coattails of what Ms. Baptiste Perez said, that it occurs to me, this is a messy topic. Who wants to deal with this? And it appears that people in the past, the easiest thing was to just, okay, let's not talk about it. But eventually it comes to a head. And the issue of EAT came up, and it went the way it went. But it begs the question of what happens in the future. Because again, other requests will come. Eventually you'll get to a point where you're going to have a really serious conversation. And the conversation we're having here now is not the one you want to have 5 years from now, when you're backed into a corner, trying to figure out who should you give this to, who should you give that to. So this kind of sets a foundation for the folks that are going to be here 5, 10, 15 years from now. It'll give them something to look at and say, okay, this is what we should do. So it's a difficult conversation. It's going to be a lengthy one. It's not something I think is going to be solved overnight, but it's an important one that will, you know, save some unfortunate decisions from having to be made way, way, way down the road. So I think this is important, even if we've had trouble getting up and running.
Yeah, well, not just us, everybody.
Everybody.
You know?
Like I said, if this has been going on for 10 years.
Yeah.
And that was the solution, let's just not talk about it and hope they go away.
Right,
Well, that's not the answer.
here we are.
So
Right.
That's that other side of the coin I was talking about.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have anything from Mr. Elsing? Well, that's it. Any closing remarks?
Closing remarks. It seems like your guys' heart is in the right place. Continue to follow that. The one thing I will say is the nuclear option, I think Branford is the most recent one to have done this, who acted on this in the past few months. I don't think they did it because, you know, they hate all religions. I think to them, it was just the clearest, simplest way out of what John was very eloquently describing as an incredibly difficult task. It was just like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? There's so many branching questions that this discussion creates that I think sometimes the nuclear option is just like, this is the only way to pursue equality and not be sued in this specific legal scenario. is just nobody gets anything, which is honestly the least satisfying scenario 9 times out of 10 for people at a negotiating table or on a board of ed or at the dinner table. You know, nobody getting anything is kind of not the solution everybody's looking for. But I don't think it should be frowned upon as like a loss. You know, it is a very valid option, because a lot of what I've heard, sort of the logical conclusion that a lot of these things take you down, is that anybody can come to present any holiday and get it canceled. But again, like the other board member was saying, don't try to create an answer for a question that may not exist. Maybe this is the last holiday that will ever be pursued by a Bridgeport community for the next 30 years. You know, I don't know. You guys don't know that. You know, the policy may be the best way forward, but it may not be a problem anymore. But again, doing nothing seems a little wrong, I think, in this scenario because of that secondary question about equality. You know, you want to create something that makes the community feel involved and represented. It just can't be religious in nature, unfortunately. And I think John's leadership on saying wanting to leave, you know, a roadmap for future boards, you know, is great. And I hope you guys come up with an answer. I'm here. Call me, email me. Patrice McCarthy is here, general counsel. Call and email her. You know, when you come to a decision, always engage Rebecca. I always highly suggest that. But, you know, I'm happy to talk through this problem. And like John said, this is not, we didn't answer it tonight. I mean, I didn't, at least maybe you guys did. But, you know, it may take a while, but I think it's worth the road ahead. And, you know, just the one parting thing I will say is separate the two questions in your mind. Are we violating the First Amendment, which does not care about equality? And then secondarily, are we promoting the equality we want to promote?
Even though I said that was closing remarks, we have a couple more hands up. So, Joe?
It just,
I should have kept this shorter. Now I've raised even more questions.
no, although I'm for the option 4 with no policy. If this committee is moving in the direction of creating a policy, perhaps we should have CABE go to work and give us a draft of their policy, since they're the policy experts and they've never done it before for this particular issue. Maybe they could be helpful and we can engage their services, which I believe is part of our package, correct?
I don't work in policy. I am not, I mean, as the staff attorney, like I do a lot of different things, but you know, a request can come into the policy department, and if they see a need for creating a policy that's going to affect more than just Bridgeport, you know, they'll draft one. But again, I don't think the problem is drafting the policy.
It's deciding it.
Like if you guys knew what you wanted to do, I could literally write it right now in 10 minutes, you know,
Right.
just based on my typing and legal ability. You know, the problem is not what I'm going to put in the policy. The problem is what you guys want in the policy.
That's right.
That's what you guys need to decide as a board first. It doesn't matter if Rebecca or CABE writes it, you know, and that's why I think we don't really have one on this, because it's so incredibly specific to what you want to achieve as a board, with it being laden with a minefield of legal problems, you know, because again, we're not lazy people. The reason we don't have a sample on this isn't because we don't feel like writing one. It's just, it's such a difficult legal issue, and it's so district specific about what you want. I mean,
And
that's,
I'm just wondering, as the other districts, I think it was 2 other districts in Connecticut that already approved deed. Have they faced similar issues and want similar policies? Have they reached out for any?
they did not engage me personally. And we didn't create a policy. I could ask our policy staff tomorrow if they came up. Actually, that's going to be fruitless, because I asked them last week when this problem was first brought to my attention, have we dealt with this issue and do we have a sample, you know, and we just don't, you know, and they couldn't remember being asked this, you know, like I said, the most recent thing I know of is Brantford, and they just sort of had a generic statement on being non-religious and non-denominational, and, you know.
We could do too, right? Take them all away. So I think that's where you were saying, as Bridgeport, we're actually being cutting edge.
Well, yeah, and I mean, obviously my personal response to Branford is that our district looks nothing like Branford,
Right.
you know? So obviously what works for them is likely, not to say that it wouldn't work for us, but it would put the next generation of board members sort of in the same spot. And, you know, it's a real opportunity to lead. And I think we should take that into consideration.
Ms. Baptiste Perez, you have your hand up still?
Yeah, Conrad pretty much summed up what I had to say is don't create an answer to a question that doesn't exist. The EAD question exists. We've made the decision that looks like it passes the lemon test. From my understanding, the creation of this was trying to answer questions to a changing population. And I think part of the implication is that, well, what if we have changes in the demographics? Can we take back a holiday? Because no one in the district, it would create, for example, maybe taking back something because it's not causing a disruption in the school day by the educators or the students. But the fact of the matter is that if there's no problem, I don't see why trying to create something doesn't exist. And to the extent that like EAD was a movement that took time, that was encouraged by additional policy, a growing and a change in the demographics, an increase in the population of Muslim following that religious background in this city, created the momentum that was needed to track that particular information. But as far as like other holidays that have not come to our attention, spreading information, either if it is something, maybe it should be brought forward and it will be evaluated at a later time, but nothing else is on the table as far as I know. So I don't.
Well, Diwali could be next,
Well,
you know? Likely.
Wait,
things
I'm
have
not
actually,
done with my comment.
Okay.
Just because it doesn't exist or I'm not aware of it, like this is something where we probably should just inform the community of the option and see what comes into fruition. And then when the problem, well, that's lawyer talk. But if the event presents itself, then we can go about answering it. But there doesn't seem like there's a push right now for one example was Diwali, the Lunar New Year. Like we don't have that right now. So I don't understand why we're trying to create a policy to something that's not in front of us. And as we can see, it's already difficult. So I don't see the purpose at this particular time. And it does give us time to grow as a district as to how we're going to collect data moving forward. And I don't think we should take any action. Oh, well, it's up to the committee, but I don't see the pressing issue at this time to take any action.
it actually has been brought up by at least one board member that I know of different holidays as suggestions. So we did set out.
But that's the board member and not the community at large.
Right, I understand. And we did set out, I did state in the first meeting that we were not going to try to be preemptive and change the calendar as it may have been suggested. So there seems to be need for this. And I know you did mention earlier that maybe you did see a reason for policy or maybe not. So it's definitely worth discussing. And I'm glad that there's participation from other board members as well as the committee. So does anyone else have anything? Have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Conrad.
Later, guys. Good luck.
Thank you.